Good morning, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Hi, my name's Christine Clement, for those of you who don't know me, but looking around I kind of seem to know a lot of people here. I have absolutely no connection with Pongakawa at all. I have driven through it quite a few times, but no family connections or anything like that. However, I have written a few books about Te Puke. This is the first one. For those of you who haven't seen it, this is a chronological history from the arrival of the Te Arawa Waka at Makatu up to the 31st of December 2006. One of the things that you certainly notice over time when you're writing history like that is things change, communication especially. Communication has just gone out of order. If you think about watching TV last night, and I think it was last night, and there was a British reporter standing in the street and there were gunfire going over his head. And I'm thinking, I'm quite pleased we didn't have that in the First World War, or any wars. So communication, and in the early days of Te Puke, there is a story in here about how it took them 5 days to get from Tauranga to Te Puke. On a good day today, you can probably do it in half an hour, but that's on a good day. So that book, I've got a few copies of that left, not many, about 4, and we've sold out otherwise. And from that, I did this book, which is family histories of families of the Te Puke district, up to 1909, except I missed one family, Bill Knutson. His family came in October 1909, but they didn't start school till January 1910, that's why I didn't pick up that they'd come earlier. And so Cedric helped me with this, and of course there's been a family and also a lot of the other Pongakawa early families that were here. Some very, very interesting stories in here. Tarawera eruption was a huge thing, huge. And we actually have the diary of a school teacher, a woman school teacher who was at Makatu at the time, and her whole diary is in here. And explaining they thought it was White Island to start with, and how things happened. And of course Mr. Bena was the postmaster at
Yes, because all of the communication lines to Rotorua were down, so all of the communications with the government went through. And I had his Morse key, which they used to communicate at that time.
Yeah, so quite a lot of local history there. So they're on, I've only got a few of those left too. I've probably got about 20 left. So I have got some here. My darling husband somewhere is floating around. And then we came to book number 3, which is Te Puke and the First World War. After the First World War, or the Great War, as it was called, there was a war memorial at the Te Puke school, which the headmaster at the time had gone through and had wrecked it. You had your war memorial here, and the only other one was in the Anglican church. And if you go into the Anglican church, just go in the doors and look immediately to your left on the wall, there's a little framed thing that nobody ever looks at, and when you actually go and look at it, it's a whole list of handwritten names from the First World War. And subsequently what happened when the Te Puke War Memorial Hall was opened, a war memorial to the First World War had been included, and it had been carried on at the RSA and also carried on at the centre. But it didn't take very much to find out that there were a lot of names missing from that war memorial. So subsequently, Ernie Dix, who was a life member of the Te Puke RSA, he had been working on Te Puke soldiers of the First World War who'd been killed, and so had I. And I happened to mention to Alan Cotter, and then Alan Cotter comes rushing into the travel agency one day and says, "There's this other man who's working on the soldiers too." And I'm like, really? So Ernie and I got together and found out how many were missing, and I think there were 28 names missing. Wow. So subsequently, this book is the history of those 28 men. I also have a website on Te Puke, but it's a great long name, so the best way to find it is just put Te Puke in sooty, like I'm a little black cat, into Google, and it will come up. And I have 1,600 pages of data on there, not all about Te Puke, but there's a lot of it is things like Wise's directories, school rolls, early school rolls, and indexes to books. And unfortunately, with Cedric's wonderful 100 and counting, I'm only up to about page 10 to index it. So, but we have done the other Pongakawa books. So, but what I have been doing for the last 3 years, and that's why I'm a bit out of kilter, is working for a group in Wairoa in the Hawke's Bay. And they were given a grant to research their soldiers from the Great War. And they kind of thought, about 350. Well, they found me through a friend, mutual friend, and I'm now up to about nearly 1,000. It's about 990 men and women from the Wairoa area, or who have a connection with Wairoa, that were involved in the First World War. Do you remember that TV program about the Anzac nurses? And Andrea Preble, who was out of Outrageous Fortune, she played a girl called Hilda Steele, and Hilda Steele was from Wairoa. And so she was in the Australian Army Nursing Corps, and her brothers were all in British regiments. And at the moment, I'm working for Glenn Harper at Mercy University, working on New Zealanders who served in forces other than New Zealand. I have about 8,500 names. Okay, of those, about 1,800 were killed. Subsequently, what happens with those 1,800 is they don't turn up on national war memorials in Auckland because they weren't technically New Zealanders. What happened and how I found an enormous amount of them was if you attended a boys' school, you know what I mean, the boys' schools, Christ College, King's, Wanganui Collegiate, that sort of thing. You did cadets, officer cadets at school, and of course a lot of these boys had been trained in the military. So they joined up with the New Zealand Expeditionary Force, left New Zealand, and then got headhunted by the British and put into the British regiments as an officer, and then subsequently were killed. So you're not counted as a New Zealander. Also, any of the fans of Blackadder here? Blackadder, War, it's I watch it all the time. It's the best story of the First World War. And the 60 Minuters were the men who joined the Royal Flying Corps. That's about how long they lasted, 60 minutes. And a lot of them were New Zealand officers who had gone from the New Zealand Expeditionary Force to a British regiment, and then were again headhunted for the Royal Flying Corps, or later the RAF, and then were subsequently killed within, I think, I'm not quite sure, but it's not 60 minutes, but it's certainly very, very short. They just killed them, they all died off. So that's been quite interesting. And thousands of New Zealand girls and men were in the voluntary aid. Now, a lot of people think of the VAD as being a young girl. A lot of men joined the voluntary aid detachment because they could drive people between hospitals, that sort of thing. So there's a lot of sort of elderly men members of the voluntary aid. You had the English girls who worked at the local New Zealand hospitals, and what did they do? Who did they marry? Lovely Kiwi boys. In fact, one of the funniest stories, and please take this the right way, a full-blooded Maori gentleman from Taranaki Lane by Noel McLeod, Welcome Bay Road, married his nurse, English nurse, as white as she came, and brought her out to Taranaki Lane to live in the pa. Not quite sure how that went down, but anyway, their son then joined the RAF during World War II and was killed in Canada before he got to Europe. So a lot of these English VAD girls, of course, ended up in New Zealand, being married to a nice young gentleman. And then, of course, you had the wealthy daughters from New Zealand who who paid their own fare to go to Britain to work in the hospitals. And you have things like the official hospital visitor for Canterbury and the official hospital visitor for, and they were ladies from New Zealand who were quite well healed, who could go over there and work in the hospitals. So if your son was in hospital, and you were from, because we were Auckland, here, Auckland Province, you wrote to the official hospital visitor for Auckland, and she would go and see your son and make sure that he was fine. So, but I'm just going to do a quick talk today. Where's Freddie? Oh, okay. Now, as I say, you're very lucky here because you've got one of the first war memorials, and it's actually correct. Well, not quite, but it's not far off it. You have Mr. Beamer, who's Mr. Hickson's great uncle. Yeah, and he was on Clonmel. Is that how you say it? Clonmel. Yeah, and he went off to the war. He was also, as far as I understand, one of Massey's Cossacks. A lot of the Taupuki boys are named who went to Auckland in 1913, but the Pongakawa and Pongakawa boys are just noted as sort of 20 men went from here, so it's quite a lot. So obviously this was a very conservative Tory area because there was no way you were going to let those strikers take over the war. So these family, the interesting thing about these names on the war memorial is they're all still here. Who's that? You want to answer it? Sorry, run away, you know. And then, as I say, we have, Mr. Beno had 4 sisters. One who married...
4 sisters.
Yeah, one who married Hickson, one who married Court, one who married Ball, and one who married... Kramer Walters. Yeah, so... and then the other Beno family is the other Beno family. They're related, but... then we have William Blaymars, which Cedric has told us about. Then Louis Gleeson, and I'll just tell you who he worked for. I presume it was probably Cedric's grandfather that got the work done for the war memorial, would it have been?
I couldn't say.
No, it's because whoever it was did it very quickly. And, sorry, because I'm trying to find here.
This way you're doing that, Albert Burt who's on there, he was actually a Lance Corporal, not a trooper.
Yes, that's right. Well, that's what I was saying to them, because we didn't realise, and also McDougall spelled wrong, I think, too.
May I ask something, Christine?
Oh, hello. How are you?
Is there anything about the war memorial at the Pongakawa school, and anything about the soldier settlement farm that was Rogers Beach?
Yeah, we've talked about this before, Pat.
Is that in that book too?
No, this is the boys that were killed.
Oh.
There is about that in my other books. I'd love to do another book from 1909 to about 1929. Unfortunately, to get a book printed these days, I'd have to sell this for about $90, and I can't see too many people paying $90. Or I could get them printed in China for about $5, but I would have to get a $4,000 off them.
Because that area is also particularly special.
Well, that's not, yes, the Yohanipania soldier settlement, but there's also a soldier settlement in Tomato Road where Colin Marshall's farm is.
Yes.
And there was also another soldier settlement out at... No, that's second war. First war is Natush, where Natush's are. Billings Block, yeah. So that was not the only soldier settlement, no. Now, Louis Gleeson, he was a farmhand for the Ball family. So again, the family comes back, you know what I mean, all the names still there. And Henry Hardwick was a farmhand for the McDougall family, Yohanipania. So they kept their, the...
Slaughter?
Yeah, let the boys... Now the Hughes brothers were up opposite Pemberton's up. I'm not sure of my directions, but Bush Road?
Bush Road.
Yeah. And one Hughes brother was born in Wales and the other brother was born in London before they came out to New Zealand. So they came out as a family group. Unfortunately, it was quite a large family when they came out, but I haven't been unable to find any descendants of that in the family at all. So whether they just kind of all died out, their next of kin was listed as their sister, who was still Miss Hughes in 1916. So it appears that that family has died out, which is a real shame. We have Bob Lewis, and he worked in the sawmill hand for Brown's sawmill, so up in the bush again, and there was a letter that he'd written which was published in the Bay of Plenty Times just after he died, the Te Puke Times just after he died. So it's quite fascinating having people familiar with Papers Past. It's brilliant. It's Papers Past. It's you have to read it online, but it's newspapers from all over the country, and you can just type in a name, like you can type in Blaymires plus Pongakawa, and then you read a whole article about them that's published in the Picton newspaper or the. So don't necessarily just stick to your local paper. The other papers picked up lots of gossip about them, especially if it's a juicy story. Not saying it will be any of them. And then we have Ian Barnes McDougall. Is Penny here?
McDougall's aren't here.
No, okay. So from the McDougall family, they're a very interesting story. They're all tied up with Welcome Bay. No, in the early days, yeah. And then Sam Pemberton.
The Hendersons.
Pemberton, they were also up Bush Road. They were quite a big family up there. Then they left Te Puke. It's a bit of a dodgy story there actually, because the man who's listed as father is actually the uncle. Dad went to jail, and Mum and the uncle just carried on as Mrs. Pemberton and Mr. Pemberton, and nobody was any the wiser. And so the Pemberton family left the farm and went to Tauranga, and they got the contract to build the first Tauranga hospital. So that was quite, and they had big builders in Pemberton Road, Pemberton Park at Yatton. Yeah, that's the same family. Yeah. Now, Mr. Terry, he was a landowner here.
Manufacturer.
Ah, right, okay. He was the only sort of independent landowner here, was Mr. Terry. And then the last one, Harold Willoughby, his mother was called Susan Willoughby because she never actually had a Mr. Willoughby. He worked for the Ball brothers at Pongakawa as well. So they're all local families and are all still represented here, except for Mr. Terry. Whose farm did Mr. Terry?
Okay.
Do you know whose farm Mr. Terry?
Yeah. Was in more recent times found by the Klaus family.
Yeah. So he was the only independent sort of landowner here. The rest of them were either families from this area or working for families from this area. So these are the stories of, as I say, those who were deceased. One of the stories in here was the first female, white female, that sounds terrible, first European female to be born in Te Puke was she actually worked with the Eti Rout. Are you familiar with Eti Rout? She went to Egypt and she dished out things called prophylactics. Yes, you weren't allowed to mention her name. There was a friend of mine in Australia who's written a book about sex, drugs and rock and roll in the Australian Army. And the Australian men had the highest rate of ED, followed by the New Zealand men, because we're a little bit shy, just a little bit quiet. The English men were down at the bottom, they were like 10%, so they were obviously very shy. And the Canadian men were just about naught, to which you think, ugh, what's up with them? They were actually supplied with brothels by the by the Canadian government. So they had brothels for the officers and brothels for the staff, for the plebs. So hopefully you've enjoyed my wee talk. I'm sorry, I have terrible gossip. I work for Ancestry.com, and so I get to talk about people's family histories, famous New Zealanders' family histories, and everybody says to me, oh, what about Richie McCaw? And I go, oh man, he's got such a fascinating family history. He's descended from sheep farmers who married the girl next door. And they go, yeah, and I go, that's it. However, keep this to yourself. One of them was a national ploughing judge. Ploughing judge, and that was about it. So you don't get me to look into your family history, whatever you do. Thank you very much.
Cedric wants to say something.
Unfortunately, while I was speaking to you, I missed out one very vital piece of information that was concerning Miss Hay, who was looked after the Memoirs family. Now, some people have asked me, oh, what was her relationship? She wasn't, no, she wasn't. William actually detested her, but he knew he couldn't do without her. She was a devout Baptist, and William could never reconcile the hell and damnation thing with the promotion of love. And so he never liked Miss Hay. But the crux of the story is that Miss Hay was buried in Te Kuki Cemetery in 1917. And sometime after that, William put in his will that he wanted to be buried in Te Kuki Cemetery also, but as far away from Miss Hay. So if you go to Te Kuki Cemetery, you'll find Miss Hay 5 rows in, Cecilia Hay. He giveth his beloved rest, sleep, sorry. He giveth his beloved sleep. And way over on the other side, nearly falling over the edge of the hill, is William Wilkinson Memoirs.
About 15 years ago, inspired by my father's interest, I started doing family history, and just a comment, came across someone called Sooty, who kept popping up with all bits of interesting things. And actually today's the first day that
We've met.
we've met, although there's been various communications, and certainly someone who inspires me by the amount of work that she's done to record the memories and the history of the family. And like Christine, there's some very interesting things, and if you thought that our society was a little bit loose at times, when you go into the history and you get like marriage records, birth records and things, you find that life has not changed. There was just as much shenanigans going on back then.
Can I just say?
Right.
Yeah, sorry. What I meant to say, add to the bit about communication, how that's really just blowing us away. It's people's sense of humour. It's still there, and things. Sometimes you read the jokes and you kind of go, I can't quite get my head around that. But some of the things that people in Te Puke found hilarious. One of them was how to get the cows out on the main street, because one of the cows kept going into the bakery and helping herself to bread. And I'm thinking, oh yeah, okay, that's kind of quite unusual. And then the next week in the council minutes, it's got that the town man has been asked to remove the trough from the main street. And I'm thinking, oh, okay, silly cow. And so, you get funny stories like that, and I just think they're so hilarious. And the best thing to ever read if you're wanting to read history is read the letters to the editor and see what people are laughing about or what people are moaning about, and you think, man, nothing's changed. They complain about the education, the government, roading.
There was one letter that we had from one of my great-grandparents. My grandmother come from Nelson, and farming, or her brother had been farming in Many Tutu Road, and in this letter it made a comment about one of the daughters who had been sent up there to stay for a while, and the letter went something like, May has returned to Nelson. I don't think we're going to have any more problems with her anymore. And sort of having been dealing with some teenage grandchildren issues, I thought, yeah, nothing has changed in the world. But communication, I mentioned before about Albert Bennett, the postmaster at Marquee, with the Morse key. Luckily I was a ham radio operator in my youth, and Dad said, you should have this. And it just it makes you think about the changes in how we communicate, that the amount of information they could transmit over a period of time was very short. Yet, just before we came, our camera ran out of disk space and we had to transfer the data onto here. And I was just realising in 5 minutes, I guess, we would have transmitted the amount of information here about 100 times. You know, so the scale of things has just changed so much. And part of what I see with this memory, or researching or investigation to the memories, it actually gives you a foundation to understand where the future is. Because the future is what we make it. And what's the old saying? If you don't learn from history, you'll repeat it. And it's so important to have that understanding and to pass that on. And part of what we've been doing here is taking the records of the school and the history of the school and digitising it so more and more people can see it, because as you know, with libraries and so on, certain books you have to go with white gloves and a minder so that you're not ripping out certain pages or just damaging them. But in digital form, it's almost like the real thing these days. And now this is going to be shared with everyone.